Welcome to Gravity Talks, where ideas ripen. I'm Luke Carfara, and today we're exploring the complex intersections of faith, medicine, and stability in early modern England with our guest, Professor Tanner Moore. Professor Tanner Moore is a member of the Religious Studies Department at Claremont McKenna College, specializing in Christianity, early modern statecraft, and European history. His research is particularly interested in the connections of religion and medicine with humanity's timeless pursuit of physical and emotional stability. His upcoming book, A Gentleman's Calling, Richard Allestree's Transformation of the Church of England, 1619 to 1700, takes us into the life of Richard Allestree, soldier, spy, professor, and theologian, whose works help us understand the religious landscape amidst the challenges of the plague in 1665, the Great Fire of London in 1666, and theological discord in 17th century England. In this episode, we'll discuss how Allestree navigated the clash between Enlightenment rationalism and the fervent enthusiasm of Protestant dissent, how Eucharistic beliefs led to instability within the early modern Church of England, and the resonances of these historical themes in today's world, from church institutions to responses during the COVID-19 pandemic. Enjoy the podcast. Thank you for joining me today, Professor Tanner Moore. Welcome to the Gravity Talks podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So your research and teaching interests explore early modern religion and medicine. Could you share what initially sparked your interest in these subjects and what aspects you find most compelling or unique about your research?
For early modern religion, I'm kind of fascinated. If I'm going to paraphrase Dan Carlin, and I will, the kind of the extremes of the human condition and the early modern period is kind of where all that just kind of comes to head for so many different reasons. It's technologically, things are advancing. Religiously, there's new ideas. I really buy into the kind of this question of like this intellectual contagion, and so you've got these ideas that are spreading, these people that are spreading these ideas. Everything is kind of new in this way. And so in that way, it just is this kind of everything, this boiling point of, if you're thinking of Christianity, it's 1500 years of boiling points of coming together, of conflict with the church, with the state, coming to a head. And same thing with, well, really with the religion that's being intertwined within that. So really, it's just kind of fun. Not saying it's you set up the dominoes to watch them all fall apart, but that's the period we just get to continually watch things fall apart. And I studied the 1600s specifically because if everything falls apart in the 1500s, and it does, the 1600s is where they start to bring it back together. So you're kind of looking at not only, okay, we watched it fall apart, we knocked some walls down, we brought some barriers up, we created some new churches. And then this is then the 1600s is, okay, well, what are we making? And so is this, to give a very oversimplified answer, this like the state building, the religion, the new ideas, is then they start to get promulgated as law and new beliefs. So that was, especially the intertwining of religion, is very interesting. I can go on for a while. Specifically, one of the ideas is you start to see like some of the law codes really start haunting these like fears of like never again. The Anabaptist rebellion at Munster is a huge one. In the 1660s in England, you start getting law codes specifically referring back to this rebellion in England, or sorry, the rebellion in Germany that never happened to the English people, had no clue about it, and they were so afraid of something like that happening to them 130 years later that they're starting to have law codes of like the ghosts of things that could happen. So I find it fascinating. The medicine part is interesting because you get this interesting tension between like miracles and how does this work with questions of faith and religiosity, and how this is kind of this mixture. And so what got me into that, my mom's into medicine. She works in medicine. And so kind of always kind of hearing these horror stories of her ER experiences, and then going, wow, that's really interesting. And then seeing that, how that kind of meshes people's understanding of, what do you live for? The Pascal's wager of life, and what's that mean, and all of this. And so I think it's been all that kind of comes together. Like I said, that's why the 1600s is fun to study.
Yeah, and in the context of the 1600s, I think a big question is why there is a connection between religion and the human desire for physical and emotional stability.
Good, you read my bio. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. But I also have the same inclination to think about why there is a connection between religion or spirituality or any like existential philosophy to try and like quench the human desire for physical and emotional stability. So how do you see this relationship manifesting in the historical context you study?
Yes, is my short answer. I mean, I don't know, I could spend hours going on that one. Probably any question you ask me, I could probably take a couple hours. But that specifically goes back to that question of like stability. People are looking for like physical stability. They're going through war. The 30 Years War that is in this period. One of the worst wars in human history. By the time some have said it's the first total war. You're getting civilians involved. Oftentimes, you're getting just like unintentional mendicant groups. You're getting groups that are like displaced, and so you're trying to go, okay, well, you need a physical place to stay. But then so many of those wars, almost all of them, are due to, in some way or fashion, shape, or another, due to religion. So there's not only you're just being displaced because of there's a war going on. Oftentimes, this is because you have a slightly different belief than someone else, and so you're getting kicked out of areas. You're getting shuffled around. These people are moving. Horrible things are happening. So that intertwining of faith and physical stability goes along, and naturally that leads to kind of this mental stability. You want to be secure in your understanding of, am I going to have a place to sleep tomorrow that's not going to be attacked? Is there not an army outside where I'm living in my village? Is the king going to change a law that's going to change what my religion is? Is it going to be the next 3 years? Congrats, we're now a new religion again. Like in England in the 1500s would happen. There's this fear that if depending on like what time you lived in England, you could go through 4 different monarchs and you would have a slightly different version of your religion that you had no control over officially. And so that gets wrapped up, and then spiritually is that part as well. You might have your own beliefs, they might get imposed from like this kind of top down idea, is a very English kind of viewpoint. But within this, you're looking for the fact you're often, you might be displaced, you might be kicked out of areas, in the same way you're looking for that mental stability, which goes along because you're like, well, I don't know what religion I am, but all of this. And so this kind of quest to, you see this as much on the local levels as you do on this kind of anarchical Game of Thrones style, how we're going to orchestrate the populace to make sure they're all happy and okay. So yes, so that's why, like I said, it's kind of this critical junction where they're all trying to just find something that makes them stable. Oftentimes that's being looked at in religion. Oh, and then there's all the disease that I haven't even mentioned as well that tends to go along with that. The Black
Yeah.
Death came back frequently.
Can you go into a little bit more about how disease played a huge role in that, like the Black Death, and obviously that time was marked by, like it was before we had modern medicine, obviously. So how do you think physical health and diseases like the plague played a role in people's like desire for religion?
Yes. Again, I can answer probably most of these questions with yes. Frequently, you see changes in. I mean, the Black Death, its original iteration was the 1340s and 50s, but it would come back in different waves every 10 to 20 years. And so not the last really big one, there's still versions of it today. The big one in England was in the 1660s. But again, you're getting this every 20 years and something. So oh wow, we've made it through. We recovered from it. It's wonderful. Only to get hit by it again, and then this kept happening and happening and happening and happening. You see it in anything from artwork. If you've seen like the fun little skeletons that are dancing everywhere, a lot of the fun Renaissance artwork is like this. You see, so not only are they just very kind of like macabre, they're getting at the death side. You see the flip side where you're seeing like fatter pictures of baby Jesus is represented after the Black Death because they want like happy, healthy babies. And so you get this, skin and bone skeletons of wow, the horrors of war versus we want our children to grow up like this. And then you start to see the rise of like the silver spoon, like born with the silver spoon in hand, as you're trying to get like what's called legacy gifts for your children. So because the uncertainty is there, and so you're like, well, if our parents are, your parents, die potentially in the plague, they've got a physical monetary value of a spoon that you'd often sometimes wear as a necklace, because that's got all your money is in that necklace. So because of that, there's so much uncertainty within this. What's life going to be like? You see in art, we could love to get into the psychology of everything. Money is a big one. There's a lot of parallels people have made with COVID. When the Black Death hit in the 1300s in England, they tried to freeze the wages to essentially pandemic levels because there were fewer peasants. Those few peasants were then requesting more wages. The same thing happened in, you think of like a lot of the fast food employees or like the essential workers, like they're income just kind of skyrocketed in many ways because there's like not there's fewer or those want to work. So you see this as well. So it's just all of this instability, especially with there's no modern medicine. Not only do you have no idea how to treat the disease, you're trying to panic and do what you can as in any situation, but that's compounded by the fact that your medicine, your galenic understanding of the humors just does not work to solve disease. So it's in that way kind of compounded because you do all the things everybody else does, but your medicine doesn't work. So it makes it worse.
Yeah. Do you think that there's like because they're in taking your class,
Thanks.
Reform and Revolt in early modern Europe, the theme of violence, like religious violence, stuck out to me, and just it made me think about like how tumultuous and chaotic of a period it was, and like from witch hunts to religious wars. Do you think there's so much religious violence just because people disagree with each other, or do you think there's like some broader existential narrative that kind of leads people to violence?
Ooh, oh, that's interesting. So are you asking if it's like people are inherently is religion inherently violent? Is that part of the question, or is it?
That would be a component. Yeah, is
Oh,
does religion like bring people to violence just because of how like
oh, that's
dogmatic
intense.
people are, and like and especially in state building, religion is a large component of how people create their societies. So
Oh, that's quite a loaded question. I love it. When I see the, is it in that way? I guess it depends how you define violence, but I would say yes. I mean, you get this. If you want to talk about like the physical violence, I mean, you always get witch hunts or heresy trials or anything like that, and so there is this question, but it gets back to this. If we're going to go to the intellectual contagion idea, and I will, is the if what these people are preaching is not only wrong, there's something, okay, you could say, the sky is blue or the sky is green. You're like, that doesn't really matter that much. It, to some people, it might. But if the question is not only is this wrong, but is this potentially like damning your soul to hell, there might be bigger consequences. And so, in that way, it kind of gets to this question of like, that's, you saw this and you see this like in the Inquisition trials and with the Dominicans is that they would never really resort to violence. Is like the last one. The violence was always the question of the state. They're trying to get how did you get these ideas? How did you get these beliefs? But lastly, this question is going. They're unrepentant. They're trying to spread what many would see as like this disease of other beliefs. And that disease is not only, it can have you wrong, be wrong, but you can infect and harm and potentially kill and damn the soul of someone else. So in that way, it makes sense that the violence would potentially escalate to that level if that pandemic of disease got big enough. You see this in the with the Cathars, with the Pope calling the Crusade, the famous kind of line that's attributed to him is "Kill them all and let God sort them out." And so you see that if he's like, how do you know who's a good Catholic and who's a good Cathar? You're like, it's got to take some inquisition. They're like, it's too many, there's too much, there's too taken over. The threat is getting too real. And so in that case, he's like, God can sort him out. It's God's, God's going to be the great arbiter and judge and all of that. And so, yes, it makes sense that if you view the potential ramifications for wrong belief, it would make sense that naturally the violence may continue into that. But I'd say it depends on I would say it's not the norm. I would say it would take an extreme case of humanity or something to go very, very wrong. Because if you're looking at like your average person, they're not there, they're wielding a sword or what have you. Oh, in the name of violence, like no. So 99% of the time they're not. But it's the case of if it does get to that case, there is violence and retribution.
I think that's interesting because if I look at America now, just to bring it to like
Yeah,
our
modern.
modern understanding of religion and politics, I think a lot of like conservative Christian people do view the secularization of society as like a social contagion. I don't think that this like social contagion in America right now is creating violence, but I do see how it's playing out, and I do think in like more barbaric, like I guess evil time, like medieval times, I could see these like dynamics becoming violent.
Right. I mean, it gets to the question of like, is humanity's like a natural state, like this warring state or this peaceful state? And so, like I said, I wouldn't consider it the norm, but I would consider it that people have made it a possibility. And like I said, we've got more restraints on this. We've got more, if you want to take a Whiggish argument, we've got more like modernity. So in that way, yeah, I could see it. But when you think about that as well, um, everybody's going, well, what's the consequences if somebody else's political beliefs gets in charge? You get, every type of like accusation that you can throw at the other person. They're going to institute X, Y, and Z, and it's going to be awful. They're going to institute X, Y, and Z. It's going to be awful. Thankfully, very thankfully, this has never come to violence with any type of real recent thing on any mass scale. But good modernity and all of that. But it is very interesting that the possibility, at least in the the early modern period, the Middle Ages, was there. But they started to move away from that when they saw the bloodshed and the violence and like what this led to. Because you can only really sustain being continually violent against each other for so long before there's just no people to do it. And so in that way, this is kind of what bridges into the Enlightenment of going. They're starting to move away from that. Like, how did we? A lot of the ideas were going, how did we develop a belief system that was so violent? And then they're starting to kind of react away from that. This like militant Protestantism is the phrase. And so they're getting into let's kill each other, let's do these beliefs. And then after those people that had went through the war, they're like, never again, we're never going to let this happen again. We're not going to try to do that. You see this in the Enlightenment. You see this was really the same phrases used in World War I. What could we do to make these steps to never let this happen again? Because some would say that if it does get to that point, something's gone wrong. Whether or not that's the interpretation of the belief or enforcing the belief that like it should never get to violence is what some would say. So yeah, I could see it all the time.
Mm-hmm. You're working on a book project. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. It's on Richard Allestree or Allestree. I've heard his name in different parts of England pronounced very differently. And so it's his life. He was a bunch of things. He was educated at Christ Church. He lived in the 1600s, 1619-ish, 1680, died in 1681. He was a soldier, spy, professor, theologian, author of the best-selling book of the 1600s in England, lived through the plague, the fire of London, ran secret messages for Charles II, future King Charles II, and really just kind of embodied this transition. If we're going to go to that transitional period, was this transitional period from this militant Protestantism, somebody who literally took up arms and took up a gun. The quote for him is that he had a book. He was a nerd. He had a book in one hand and a musket in the other, like a gun in the other. And so you see this, and then transitioning to like, oh, we're never going to let that happen again. So that's kind of using him as this lens, this case study of how do you go from 30 years and we're going to go kill a bunch of, or 10 years, we're going to go kill a bunch of people because these horrible Presbyterians are having an uprising to, okay, we need a very stable state. We're never going to let that happen again. So that's what so much of my research is coming through that. The fun thing with him is he's kind of had his hands in all these different pockets in England within like the Royal Society. He ran Eton College for a little bit. It's kind of thanks to him. He tried to build like a nice little, it's called like the quadrangle. It's this wall, but it was like horribly ineffective. So like, I think it caught fire or burnt down. It just didn't work for like 20 years. But there's this great legend that Eton College has, and he was voted the ugliest man in England. And so I was like, okay. Never heard the story. So I went there, and the archivist was like, or the keeper of the special collections was like, have you heard the story about him being ugly? And I'm like, no. And so I go there. They're like, she's like, I should print it out. And his portrait is hidden behind the, it's in the provost's office. So like they're still using it today. And all the other portraits are nice and out there of all, they're the previous provosts that have been there. And I'm like, oh, and she dramatically pulls the curtain. They're like, it's him, it's this portrait. And this legend about 200 years ago came out that King Charles II was having a bet with his courtiers trying to find the ugliest man in England. One of them walks out, pulls Allestree aside, and the king takes him on like this kind of wild goose chase, pulls him in front of the king, and the king goes, we have to stop the bet. We stop. You have clearly found the ugliest man in all of England. And he goes, well, can you remember me when you go back to court? Allestree to the king. And they go, yes, of course. And so that's the kind of the legend of how he became the ugliest man in England. The book has like some not flattering phrases. He called him like the opposite of handsome, like pug-nosed. This isn't that bad. He's fine. But so you start to see these weird kind of stories that crop up about him, of all these little urban legends. But that's my favorite is being the ugliest man in England. That is quite a title to have. And they still keep his portrait behind a curtain to this day. And it's just like, it's all of them. They're all out there, and he's wonderful, except for him. His ugly little portrait is and that's even what it's referred to by the archivist. It's called the ugly portrait officially. So, so I get to like get in his brain for a bit. That's what I wrote my dissertation on. That's what I wrote writing on. That's like what my articles are on mostly, is him and kind of his understanding of the world and the way it works, because I think he has some rather unique perspectives.
What are some of the unique perspectives that you think like his work gives
Uh,
us an understanding, like the
so
transitionary period in the 17th century?
So if we're going to talk about different things, he revived. It never caught on, which was many things with him. He tried to invent a new writing style. Him and his two buddies didn't work. They tried to have like purposely misspellings. It's kind of this like, oh, we have this new way of shorthand. You think of like things like LOL or whatever that caught on. His didn't. It was like, so it's great. So if you're trying to find out like if it was anonymously by him, usually he tried to use these phrases, never worked. So you can narrow it down to three people. So that was it. Kind of revived again. It never caught on. A Eucharistic heresy called impanation. It was condemned in the 1300s, and then kind of brought back maybe through Andreas Osiander in the kind of the Lutheran side of things and the Reformation. Maybe it was, in fact, if we're going to talk about that contagion idea, maybe it spread to a meeting to Cranmer. Maybe Cranmer had an idea of it, disappeared for a while. Maybe it kind of went late and then pops back up. He has in his library and markings on this book, which is this. It was condemned by the Catholic Church as a heresy. That it's this really, really meta understanding of the Eucharist that when you eat, when you partake of Jesus, that the phrase is God becomes bread, or I guess the kind of the weird translation is like the embreadening of God, depending on how you want to phrase it. So the Catholic version, the Catholic understanding is that Christ is present under the form of bread and wine, is kind of the official phrase. And it kind of skips that part and just says God is bread. And so he took this theory, this kind of like was immediately condemned in like the 1300s, and then brought it up because he was trying to understand how they were eating Jesus without this interesting Catholic understanding. And so he's like, well, what if we don't use the transubstantiation bit, but we still eat God, still eat Jesus, still eat God, but what if that God is just the bread? There's no distinction between what is Jesus and what is the bread. It's just kind of all consuming in a way. Whereas in the Catholic understanding, you can kind of make a rather distinction. It's the outward appearance of bread. It looks like bread. It tastes like bread. It smells like bread. It's going to go through your digestive system like bread, but it's actually Jesus. And Allestree doesn't really make a distinction. That's one of the kind of fun ideas he had. What else did he do that was fun? He did a lot of things that was fun. His work as a spy was really interesting. But his kind of new ideas on that one, he was one of the big kind of proponents for memorializing Charles, the king. The heresy idea is quite interesting. If you want to take that, his kind of his heresy of impanation. That's what my forthcoming articles. Waiting to hear back on the drafts on that one. So that one's going to be fun. Kind of developing this real presence idea. How did the Church of England get it? How did it cause instability? And how did his ideas just kind of absolutely chuck a wrench into all of it?
So did his ideas have like an impact in the way the Eucharist was perceived during that time period? Did his ideas like stick on the wall and change thought behind the
No,
Eucharist?
no, it's great. There is literally no inclination that any of his ideas caught on, which is kind of funny. You're like that one. It's like spaghetti. You throw at the wall. That did not. That was just not. It didn't catch on. It got the idea. Some later Anglican theologians in the 18 to 1900s kind of condemned it. Not his idea, just the fact that could this be an idea? And they're like, well, that's impanation. That's wrong. And it's like, oh, okay. But he wrote the. I should have brought it with me, but it's he wrote The Whole Duty of Man. I believe he wrote The Whole Duty of Man. Most scholars believe he wrote it, which was this kind of best-selling book. And so he kind of wrote this. It's not a self-help book, but it's kind of this devotional manual. If you want to think of like Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, it's kind of written in a similar vein of this kind of short, digestible understanding, because he was preaching against this idea that salvation is just this kind of lofty, stuffy thing. You go in, you say the words, you leave, and then you've got real no knowledge. And so his was meant to be very, very, very practical. Like he would say, sleep is good, but don't oversleep because that's bad. Or, food is great. God gave us food. Don't overeat. It's going to make you a glutton. And so really this practical understanding of spirituality. His big one was, he wrote one for men. He called it The Gentleman's Calling, which is kind of the pun of the title of the book, potentially. And then he wrote one for women called The Lady's Calling, which one scholar described it as like the runaway success story of women's devotional literature. So you see this in like all of like the prominent kind of women, and the most of the prominent women in that period uh, are citing this book of like, if you're going to read this is like the one thing you want to read is The Lady's Calling. And so it's conduct literature, but it's this conception of what it means to be like a good Christian and like a good woman in that period. So you really start to see his like kind of devotional ideas really, really uptick. And there were so many of them, and then by about like 50 years later, you can find them in like secondhand bookstores everywhere. But they're very cheap, so you can kind of get one even nowadays as a rather kind of a cheap copy, which is great because it's fun. You see how much of ideas his ideas spread everywhere.
Hmm. Do you think his ideas played a large role in like transforming the way um, Christians conceptualize their roles in life in modern Christianity in America or Europe?
Uh, you could see it. I mean, there's probably, if you're going to trace like a line of, devotional literature conduct of how you hold yourself as a Christian, he would probably end up on that somewhere. I mean, to say he's up there with a campus would be quite a stretch, but you might, if you want to, make some rabbit holes, do some deep dives. I think you probably could be able to trace it, at least in the English sense, through him. You see a lot of the books are in America. Many of the books are actually here in Southern California in the Huntington Library. So we know that at least somebody collected them and either brought them here. They're in the Chicago and the Newberry. They're in the Folger in DC. So you start to see that they do kind of appear everywhere. So I could see it being influential. That's kind of the new thing I'm working on, is like how widespread can you kind of trace his ideas? Is it the 1800s? Can you see it in the 1900s? So it's something to work on. It's what I'm working on. So yes, it just depends on how far that goes.
I think it's interesting how like different ideas create, like, back to the social contagion idea, like
Yeah.
there's just a bunch of different like ebbs and flows of ideas that like some happen to be like hit the mainstream and
Yeah.
stick on, some happen to come in and go out, and I think a lot of religious thought or like Christian theology is explained by that, especially the Eucharist. What were the predominant beliefs surrounding the Eucharist in the early modern church?
Do you mean like as a whole, or do you just mean like in Christendom, or do you mean all of it?
um I guess kind of, was there a mainstream belief around the Eucharist in different times that like either
Oh,
changed or stuck, or like how is I guess it's a very
loaded.
overwhelming general
Yes.
question, loaded question of
When is, I guess, the question can kind of help narrow that down.
probably like the 16th and 17th centuries.
Well, then I guess the next question is like, to whom? Like, who's? Do you mean just Christianities, or do you mean a specific branch, or just all of it?
um I would probably the distinctions between the Catholic Church and the Church of England. I think that
Oh, well,
is.
that helps and doesn't help narrow it down. The Catholic Church was still rather simple. Jesus Christ is in the bread and the wine, bread and the wine under the form of bread and wine. This kind of gets reified in Trent, specifically reifying the Fourth Lateran Council, and really kind of include. You start to see those ideas, solidifying. It's going back to that. The Church of England's beliefs at this time were many and varied, and so this, especially in this 1600s, you have the official position adopted in the 39 Articles in the 1570s is kind of like a Calvinistic spiritual presence. And so you start to see those ideas as well. You're taking Calvin's ideas. They really like Calvin by this point. And then you get okay, it's spiritually present. You're spiritually feeding on Jesus. He may be there. It's kind of up in the air. Richard Hooker's famous theory is this, what's called receptionism, is that it only becomes the body and blood of Christ when uh, you're eating the bread and the wine. And so it's kind of in that way. So then it becomes the individual person. So instead of the priest consecrates it, then it's that for everybody. Hooker will actually say it's the faith of that individual person. So for example, like you're giving the bread and wine to somebody. Well, if they don't have faith, then it's nothing. But then the next person totally could. So it's a very individualistic experience. You see with Archbishop Laud and the 1630s, just trying to completely go away from that belief, really, in like capital R, capital P, real presence. I actually got a chance this past summer to see one of his annotations on the old prayer books, and you can see where he scratched some things out, he put some things in there, and really kind of emphasizing that this is not a spiritual thing, you're literally eating God. by the 1660s, about what I study, it does become more of like a real presence understanding that they believe you are eating God, but it's kind of iffy on how that happens. But then to say that there's ever been a uniform Anglican opinion on that is also up in the air. There's been people who believe it's more of a symbol, some people who believe that it's you spiritually, some people believe that you're literally eating, and you can find positions all across this kind of variance of belief.
And do we see the same problems of conceptions of the Eucharist in modern Christianity?
There's more of a variance of belief in the Anglican Church is going to be the one where it's going to be varied. Oh, I'd say varied, probably the most, where you've got people that are currently believing that it's you are literally basically all but or just including transubstantiation. Some that believe that it's spiritual eating. You probably might find you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that's saying it's entirely symbolic, because the 39 articles are rather against that. But within this, there's an Anglican hymn, and I always forget what it's called. I've never been able to find it again. This is essentially the part is that we don't know how it happens. So within that idea of how this transformation happens and what exactly you're eating, the variance is wild. Specifically because it's this umbrella church, it's this kind of this church that's meant for it to be everybody. So there is, in some ways, this variance of opinion of what exactly you're doing. You get this every time the prayer book changes. You're like, you have to get to these ideas of like, okay, well, what point are you really eating God? Are you not eating God? Is it like somewhat? Is it spiritual? At what point does that happen? Can you actually pinpoint the point where that changes? So the answer is there's a lot more variance within the Anglican opinion. There's an official position, and then there's what everybody tends to believe around that. And because the official position can be interpreted in so many ways, the formularies can and have been. So you're kind of working within like a set of boundaries where the Catholic Church is like, this is it. It is under the form of bread and wine. There's not much wiggle room. There's more wiggle room within the Anglican position than, say, an Orthodox or a Catholic position, where they're like, this is truly it.
I also saw you wrote an article about the Eucharist and its role in the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you dive into that more?
Yeah, it's great. It's should be out sometime. It's on this like rather quickly. I've been very, very appreciative of the journal and how quickly they've gotten back to me on comments and everything. So thank you, Theology. But they've been lovely. And so it's in one of the ways of kind of bridging this gap between there's no really, I mean, there's some research on COVID and religion that's coming out, but it's coming out every day. And, we only know things in hindsight. So first it was all being written as it's happening. Now the COVID is over in the way that, it wasn't in the early 2020s now. That we can start to really kind of look back and see things in hindsight rather with, okay, this is not just the next day something happening is new. So it gets to this question of can COVID spread disease? I leave that to science people. But more, what does your perception about it being able to spread disease? How does that impact kind of this? It's not like a return to office policy, but like return to church policy. And what does that mean for you spiritually? So this is, for example, the Catholic opinion is that if you are not taking the Eucharist for a certain amount of time, it's rather undefined. Then in that way, it becomes not spiritually damaging, because there have been monks and all of this that go long times without the Eucharist. There is kind of a minimum you should take it. But this idea that if there's spiritual benefits to this and there's physical benefits to this can heal you, this can help you, this helps you on your walk with Christ. Lord of the Rings, it's like lambus bread. That's what Tolkien was inspired by, was the Eucharist. But then the other, and so you start to see these new policies like, well, can you adore, like venerate the Eucharist through the television? And so then they're asking, like, what are the metaphysical implications of, if you're looking at the screen, like I'm looking at you, like if the Eucharist is on the other side, does that count? And it's not the Kantian intention counting. It's like, are you getting the spiritual benefits, say 3,000 miles away or close? Because then conversely, they also said that you can't do confession over the phone, because they said that the sacrament of reconciliation has to be done in person, of absolution. And so they're like, well, you can adore the Eucharist, but you can't get confession sacramentally. So you see that. But in others, like Baptists, that just do not believe it does anything. They're like, well, Jesus told us to do it. The word they use is an ordinance. They tend to just kind of ignore it. And so you see that they'll go, well, we'll get back to church when we get back to it. We've got Zoom. We've got these other things. But then you see that they don't really have a complex theology of it. So then it makes sense that they're trying to come back because the Eucharist doesn't exist, because there's no Eucharist for them to come back to. It's just a memory. But you start to see that there's pushing for it. but it's interesting. It's the Eucharist isn't like this monocausal thing, because if you're going to take this Baptist angle that you're not forsaking the gathering of believers, it's communal. You see John MacArthur here in L.A. County won. I believe he actually really did win that lawsuit against L.A. County, saying we're not going to close the church. And so that had nothing to do with the Eucharist. This is much more of a communal experience. The Eucharist is kind of on that added thing. But there were a couple megachurch pastors that were selling a kind of like a DIY Eucharist kit. It's like you could buy it online. I don't know how much it was. And you could either they prayed over it or you pray over it together at the same time, and it will cure you of COVID. But they would sell you this specifically. And so I believe it was Kenneth Copeland. I would, if this was the Joe Rogan podcast, I'd go, Jamie, check it out. There you go. I shoehorned the reference in there. I've got a friend who said he's going to listen to this. That's your reference. I believe it was Kenneth Copeland who was selling, or donations, if you want to get really technical, that you could get this and it would cure COVID. I mean, he was very adamant that this would cure COVID. So in that way, you kind of get these outliers. Like I said, in some ways with John MacArthur, it's about community and the gathering of believers. With others, it's like now you can just monetize the Eucharist to cure disease. But it gets to that question because a lot of the sociologists have looked at, well, if you're, the Orthodox use a spoon. So you're like, well, if you're just, spoon feeding the Eucharist, is that disease? They believe that it cannot spread disease. And so in that camp, you get the bishops were all saying that this cannot spread disease. If you look at their policies, like everyone do this, change this. And then, oh, hey, that's hilarious. That's the proof for the other article that came back. So small things. But, and so then you get these other ones. They're like, what about like germ theory? Like we know the disease would spread to that. And the bishops just went, the Eucharist cannot spread disease, no matter what. They're like, and so in this way, you're either like, it's Jesus. And so if you're eating Jesus, Jesus can't spread disease. And so in that way, the Catholics have the same similar fashion that it cannot. And so it's not even that it was the concern of if it can spread disease. They're like, it can't. And so, but then you get, well, if you've all got COVID and you're hanging around in the same place, like the Eucharist might not spread the disease, but you cough on your neighbor, like, and it spreads to them. That could spread disease. So it gets to that kind of that communal sacramental aspect where, but to answer the long story short, it's been on my mind this entire summer is thinking about it. And so really this idea of like what this means as a kind of it's meant to be a kind of like a primer. This is what each church believed. This is kind of how it affected their policies. And really this kind of understanding of what it means for the Eucharist, to look at what it means for gathering. What's the central focus? We all kind of know it's that, but how does this impact their understanding? And in case another disease like that happens, then you can kind of then shape these ideas around it. The Baptists will probably do this. The Anglicans will probably do this, and so on and so on and so on. And so it's kind of meant to bridge this gap between like super scientific journal articles and the fact that theology tends to just get kind of lost in the weeds of whether or not it can. So it's looking at who did it and how they believe it.
Wow.
I think it's fun.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had never thought of like the idea that like there would be theological arguments that you cannot get COVID-19 from the Eucharist because it is the body of Christ and you can't get a disease from that. That seems very interesting and complex. And I think
that brings in like all kind of like, warnings from like the World Health Organization of like, what do you mean?
I could see how there's a big disconnect between like the scientific consensus of COVID-19 and then like the diverse theological opinions of different churches across Europe and America or the world. Yeah.
Right. This one was more focused just on America, which then ironically was in a British journal. So it was great. They have to Britishize all the spellings, as they told me. And then I'm like, that's great. It's on the American church. It's fine. So
I also think it would be interesting to think about the political aspect of churches, because I do think COVID-19 was like particularly politicized, or people's conceptions of COVID-19 was politicized. So I think that could also go into the way like evangelical Christians would be more likely to be like very conservative or more Republican. So that could go into the way they conceptualize like meetings, and obviously evangelicals don't actively practice the Eucharist.
Right. And so it gets to that kind of communal aspect. And I'm not an American historian, so if you are, I apologize. Whoever's maybe listening, is this question of like, if we're founded on like these principles of the separation of church and state, or this not being able to impose ideas, and I know I'm, oversimplifying. studied one guy in the 1660s. But this idea that uh, if you're founded on this idea that the government can't really tell you what to do church wise, I mean, what Jefferson, it was in the letter to the Danbury Baptists of having this wall of separation. It's not really enshrined legally in that sense, that kind of this misconception. Again, not an American story. But you get this question that if you're kind of inherently founded on this idea of separation, who is the government to tell you that you can shut down? It's I don't see libertarian in like I guess in some way, yes, in the political context, but you see some of the churches taking that stance of like, who are you to tell us that we can't worship God in that fashion? So you absolutely saw that. If I had more time in the article or just anything like this, because that gets into this kind of government relationship type thing. Because you see places like present day Russia, where the state is in many ways just married to the church, the modern Orthodox Church. You see that some of these things are like just echo chambers of the other. There was a monk that might have been a higher monk. I think he was a priest. I think he was a higher monk. He was a priest monk, so he was both. That denied COVID existed, and he was going and he was calling this all of these like it's like a fake disease. All these things. This was really early on, probably within like a month of COVID happening. And the Church of Russia, if I recall the article correctly, had started to shut down, and he would not. He refused, and so people were coming to him because he's going, "Oh, I can't spread it, can't spread it, can't spread it." And then eventually they arrested him, and they're like, "We don't care that you're part of the church. You are acting against what the church has officially said on these closures." And so in this instance, I don't know if he was defrocked or laicized. I know even as recent as this year, 2024, that this was somewhat ongoing because the process kept going and going and going. So in the areas where the church is kind of wedded to the state in that way, you see it differently. And similarly in England as compared to this America, where you're like, oh, there's no establishment of religion. Question. But that gets to that communal aspect of, do you go along to get along because your church is part of the government, and how that applies? That would be another article that someone certainly would have to write. Would be quite interesting.
Do you have any particular opinions about American Christianity? And do you think it's a unique phenomenon?
Yes, to both. You'd have to say which part of it. American Christianity is an inherently unique phenomenon in so many ways, because it's kind of born out of this, especially the early 1800s. If I had to pick another period to study, it would be that, because you're getting all these, the kind of this weird question was, they're all coming from England. America's a new nation. And for like the first time, really ever, they're not told what to believe, which was, they're coming out of the Church of England and they're going, okay, you believe this, you're going to be born in the Anglican Church, or maybe a Catholic if you're kind of a recusant. But for the first time, no one's telling you what to believe. You can believe anything, and it's not against the law. It's not wrong. They won't bar you from attending certain colleges or being a professor at certain colleges, as was the case with Oxbridge in the 1830s. And so what comes out of that is then fascinating, of all these different beliefs of people kind of claiming they're God, or claiming they're these new things, or you're kind of putting new ideas in there, or all these specific just kind of spiritualist movements that come out of that, or intertwined with it. Really in that period is what's kind of unique, because there is no limitation. There's no blasphemy laws like there are in other places. And so I think that kind of the social experiment, then what comes out of that is fascinating. But sadly, that would be something else I would love to study more in depth, that I just don't.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to my mind when I think about American Christianity is like the prevalence of evangelical thought, as
on everything, or just all of it?
No, specifically kind of how it fuels the conservative political movement of MAGA. Because I know there's tons of Christians in America that aren't conservative or
they kind of run the gamut. Yeah.
MAGA supporters. Yeah. But I think it's such a bizarre phenomenon how intertwined a lot of evangelical theology is looped in with like Trump supporters or just MAGA. After the assassination attempts, you see
like my Twitter or something.
My Twitter feed is filled with "God save Donald Trump" or like,
right.
Yeah. So I think that's a bizarre phenomenon.
I've seen things that is really interesting. Of I've heard tell. I have a friend who studies this, not the religion. I guess he kind of studies the religion side of things. These kind of modern American conservative. There's no naturally religion's tied up, so He'll know more than I do on this. But what's fascinating to me is you see these connections of I've heard lately within the past like 2 months of these pastors that are going, if you don't vote for Donald Trump, you're going to hell, or you're spiritually damaging your. This is like these kind of capital E evangelicals, but this question of is does voting for Trump send, does not voting for Trump send you to hell, or does God weigh your political opinion in the grand scheme of things? The gold line defense that he's playing up there in heaven, and you're like, okay, well, this time you voted for. I mean, I've heard the arguments on every side of going, if you vote for Trump, you're voting for name every type of thing that you could think of, epithet to think of Trump, of how horrible you would be. I mean, the list goes on. Oh, you did this. You're voting for this horrible person. Yada yada. This, and then the same way, the argument specifically that I was referring to was if you don't vote for Trump, obviously the idea of abortion comes in. So it's going, well, you're allowing abortion. And that means that by not voting for Trump, you're actually an accessory to abortion, and then God will hold that against you in your soul. And going, well, what about like the bad things Donald Trump has done, and all of this? And so you're going, well, does God? Well, what happens if you vote for Trump? Like spiritually, he's done that. What's he supporting? And so, but is this kind of this unique phenomenon that like your political vote you can cast or not casting could have spiritual ramifications, which I think is like really, really fascinating. And somebody, some historian in the next couple of years, the historian of the 21st century, is going to just have a field day writing a book on what, the soul damning effects of your political vote. It does happen at the local level, or this, or, well, you didn't vote for the candidate that was going to give more housing for the homeless, so just straight to hell. You didn't live up to the commandments of Christ, and you're like, oh, okay. So that has just been obviously the election's coming up. Been on my mind lately is seeing this extension of like the spirituality of voting, or the spiritual ramifications of voting is kind of a better way to put it. So, and that way, yes, it's it's fascinating.
I think as I analyze the way people think about theology and politics, I think there's like arguments, like Christian arguments for both candidates, and they both make sense according to the Christian theology you hold, and it's kind of just like this mutual relationship where a person's theology and a person's politics are like informing each other, and I can't really like say, oh yeah, their politics are informing their theology or their theology is informing their politics. I think it's like kind of this mutual relationship. It's, I don't know.
Symbiotic, I guess, is the kind of
Yeah,
the word to
symbiotic.
use.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, or sacramental if you want to use the religious term. Like one is always kind of informing the other. No, and so that's what I mean. I think that's kind of this interesting side of things, is that one is continually always informing the other. I mean, if I had to guesstimate, I think I would say the theology drives the politics, because I don't know if we're going to go back to that spiritual stability side, that if we had to like do a Maslow's hierarchy of what those needs would be, to them I would probably say spiritual satiety is at the top, and then they're like, well, how do we get, or then to the next one, it's going to be, well, you're going to get physical satiety by following the spiritual things. The spiritual thing is going to be who you vote for. And so I could see that as this kind of this that sounds like a horrible trickle down economics. I promise it wasn't. But is informing all things in that way.
Do you think this kind of intersectionality of politics and religion has always existed? Like, did this exist in the time periods you study?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's always kind of like a different form of in which way that you view it. I mean, if you're going to take like the kind of the battle between like King John and Pope Innocent, that this question of they're fighting over who gets to appoint bishops, and you're like, well, who's the real ruler of England? Is it the king, or is it the Pope, or is like what role does the king have in these spiritual ways? So in that way, you're always getting it. You could make an argument that Constantine took political control of the church in the 325, the First Council of Nicaea. Um, Dan Brown does that. It's like, oh, the Roman state came, or the Roman Empire came in and dictated these philosophies, and so you see that, or the religious edicts. You see in like what I study is it's called the Clarendon Code. Is the fancy words. These set of laws of you can only be 5 miles without, or you can't if you're going to worship in a church, it has to be outside the certain area, and only certain people can hold office, and you have to be rightly ordained by a certain bishop. That's kicked out Presbyterians. And so, absolutely. And so those people were the same ones that were informing. And in England's case, the bishops still are, in the House of Lords. They have a seat, a voting seat within the government. And so that it's so intertwined. Less so with the House of Commons. If you want to make more of a direct reference to British parliamentary politics. But then in the same way, in England, the monarch is the one who ordains bishops, has that power to ordain someone, or ordains the bishops. So absolutely. So in that way, it's actually rather uniquely intertwined. But no, I think it was the kind of modern evangelical case, or the modern American case, is such kind of like a pun intended. It's a wild west of things, of kind of seeing what new ideas come out and all of these things, and that's why this American experiment, if you want to take it that, on religiosity is personally fascinating. I'm teaching a class on like new religious movements and true crime and cults next semester. So if you're here, sign up for it. No, you're going to be studying abroad. So next time. But this idea that you can get things like Jim Jones's The People Temple, and how do you go from People's Temple, no apostrophe. How do you go from this rather guy who was enthusiastic, would go around in his early childhood listening to different preachers, kind of gauging how they taught and preached and all this, to the kind of the mass killing in Guyana. And so, but that was with his basis in Christianity. That was in Gary, Indiana, of all places. Then I think they moved to somewhere in California. I want to say San Francisco, and then they eventually kind of made it down into Guyana. But that has its basis in Christianity. Same thing with Heaven's Gate. Same ideas. Is kind of taking this like messianic Christ-like figure. I think one of them actually believed he was Christ. Saying that, if you want to look at David Koresh and the Waco, also heavily Christian ideas. I don't think he was claiming to be God in that instance, but you're also getting these Christian communities. And so, but they're all stemming from these Christian ideas. And then you look at these kind of disastrous consequences of, in Waco, it ended in tanks and killing. In Guyana, it ended with the flavor aid that was used to kill everyone. And so, but they all have their basis in these kind of Christian, used the basis of Christian roots. Whether or not they're Christians, a whole other matter of debate. But the fact that they use Christianity in a way that really only uniquely American sense could is it's fascinating.
I wanted to ask, to your knowledge of like the 16th and 17th century, what type of like if there was any, was there anti-Semitism present in those time periods within Christianity?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The biggest one is kind of the glaring is Luther's. I would say classic, but that's not the right way to describe it. Infamous, if you want to use another word. Text is on the Jews and their lives. And you see this kind of text always promulgated throughout of all these bad things about this rather virulent anti-Semitism. Even the modern Lutheran Church like walks back on these ideas. They're like, this was his opinion. There are all these things, but that Luther's on the Jews and their lives kind of becomes a basis for more kind of modern. It wasn't a basis, but it wasn't the basis, but it becomes a basis kind of that you can use and kind of go back to as these anti-Semitic tropes. Specifically, that's in the 1500s, but it's interesting because you see that because of this new kind of Protestant ideas and how Luther was shaping them. For a while, the Christian church was ordered, different popes were ordering to protect Christian communities. You see every time there's a horrible outbreak of disease, like the Black Death, or just really any disease, the Jews always tend to get scapegoats. The term Christ killer always gets thrown around in that fashion. They're the ones that killed Christ. You get it kind of becomes like a horrible trope of the world domination or out to poison the world. They're all confessing as this under torture, but they're confessing under torture because that's what they wanted them to say, that there's these horrible people taking over. Again, often for scapegoats or famines or dearth or anything, they look for a blame, and they look for these people they can call Christ killers. And so absolutely in that way that you tend to see it in waves within that. And I believe it was actually Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, that, again, somebody fact check me on this, is whether or not the term the Jews were the ones that killed Christ. I think it was removed from some of the foundational documents. It was kind of moved away from this understanding. And it was believed as meant to be more inclusive, that kind of like in this way that we all killed Christ, or the Romans killed Christ. But you saw this used as a kind of a reaction against this kind of over anti-Semitism that was used to justify this belief. And so it is kind of moved away from this because it could be interpreted or used in that fashion.
I forget which gospel it is, but to my understanding, it stems from like the crucifixion narrative of Matthew. or mark.
Well, they go,
Um,
his blood is on our hands, is kind of the
yeah,
phrase when they're going, crucify him, crucify him. You know, you want him or Jesus or Barabbas. Uh, they're like, it was Barabbas. And they're like, well, then he goes, well, you know, so be it. And they're like, well, our blood, what's the phrase? Is like, our blood be on our head and our children's head or something like that. And so you see that can obviously be interpreted in such a way. And then you can get the whole, you know, Christ killer trope and everything. So it's absolutely there. Yeah.
and then in some of the like letters of Paul, you find like I guess polarization of like Gentiles and Jews, and like you kind of see like this, like he deepens the crevice for their, or the
Oh,
he deepens the, I
no,
guess,
Chris, that's a good thing. I was
propensity.
going to say divide. Yeah.
Yeah, it deepens the crevice and allows for more of like the anti-Semitism that built upon, I guess, in the
Yeah,
future.
you could see it, built upon or justified, I think is a good way to put it. And you can kind of see it in that fashion where if you want to make an argument, you could go back and pull out those texts. I mean, you see that. Do you remember Westboro Baptist Church? Was that kind of before your time? Slightly, might have been
I remember talking about it in your class actually, but I was,
outside of me then.
yeah, I was somewhat aware of it. Yeah.
Oh, but yeah, I was going to say you see the tropes, but again, it's a rather isolated case. I had a professor in undergrad that was rather fascinated by them, but he was Jewish, but he was fascinated in like the levels of anti-Semitism they got. He actually went, took a bunch of students, and interviewed them. And then one day in class, he's like, "I'm going to show you all these interviews." We're like, "How did you even get an interview?" He's obviously has no reservations about being Jewish, and so he was like, "Oh, they called me all these names and did all these things," but he's like, "The interviews were great." And I went, "Okay," but he really was kind of digging into this. What's the actual fundamentalism is the kind of proper religious studies term that kind of leads down to that idea is where anti-Semitism often is part and parcel with it. But again, that's like very, very, very niche fundamentalism, not in the kind of way that it might be construed today. But it's certainly there. It still is there.
I also see like the rise. I don't know how much you're on social media, but you see the rise of like these sentiments and people like Candace Owens,
And that is
or
not
like
really on. So I'm on social media for the memes, and that's about
that's
it.
that's the good parts. The
Yeah,
rest are
here's the good part.
pretty,
Yeah.
yeah. But there's a conservative like a pundit, and
Yeah.
she's like a political
Pundit.
creator.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a political pundit, and the term "Christ is King," the like anti-Semitic, often used as an anti-Semitic
Oh,
trope, has kind of resurfaced in conservative, like far right conservative circles.
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see like social media and like current political events kind of like rekindle the fire of these old like beliefs.
Right, or just the using it. I mean, I guess I would say it depends on like your view of like what if you consider the phrase "Christ is King" anti-Semitic. I mean, I think of like the fifth monarchists in England. They're kind of their famous not logo slogan in the 1650s was "No king but King Jesus," but they were reacting against well, the idea of having a king at all. So, right, you could see this, but I could also see the idea of like, oh, well, Christ is king. Well, that means that everybody's going to do it. So naturally, you could see where that then would be extended or construed in that way towards like an anti-Semitic remark. And so that's the thing is how it's. I don't say how you spin it, but it is how you kind of utilize it in that fashion. If you would, you know, if somebody were to use that in that way.
I mean, like saying Christ is King, obviously, like in the if you break it down term by term from a Christian theological perspective, like it's obviously not meant to be anti-Semitic, but you often see these pundits or people online
Oh,
using it in response to a Jewish person online, or
oh, that's horrible.
like in combination with like a conspiracy theory
That's
about
even
Jewish
worse.
people. Yeah.
Oh, oh, that's awful. Okay, so I guess like piecing those two things together, I can totally see where you could see that, like, you know, what might be to some like an innocent thing, and then you're going, oh, you can absolutely use it to harm others in that fashion.
Hmm.
Huh. And that's
And
why.
most, and I feel like most, I don't want to say it, most people who are like somewhat aware of even what like the connotations of that phrase are avoid
Oh,
it most of the time. So
Right.
like if you
So,
do happen to see somebody saying it a lot, it kind of like red flags in my brain. Like,
oh, I
oh,
was just thinking of the Kanye West Jesus is King album. But
I
uh,
think unfortunately, knowing Kanye West's
yeah,
history of anti-Semitism,
I was just about to say, I'm like, well, I
yeah,
don't know. I remember hearing something about that. Again, that's like my only foray into that. I'm like, oh yeah, the Chick-fil-A song, and I was like, oh yeah, Kanye West.
yeah. At the time, I didn't think twice about the Kanye West like album, but
No,
then
I mean,
after like
I don't
the
know what it was intended to be, but
yeah,
the authorial intent and all that. But Chick-fil-A, I mean, it makes me just want Chick-fil-A, but
yeah.
I really do want Chick-fil-A.
Well, I think we covered
Do
a
we have any
lot.
less deep conversations to end the talk on?
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining the Gravity Talks podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.